On a cool Saturday afternoon in April of 2014, 60-year-old Gary Terrell was crouched down in the dirt, pulling weeds from his beautiful backyard garden. Even though it was only about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, Gary could still feel a bead of sweat dripping down his forehead. Gary also felt a slight ache in his back, and he laughed at himself because digging in the dirt apparently was not as easy as when he was younger. But even with the sweat and the muscle aches, there was still no place Gary would rather be than in his garden on a pretty spring day. Gary and his wife Jan had lived in their house in Springfield, Missouri for over 20 years, and the house itself looked a lot like the other homes in their small suburban neighborhood. It was red brick with a large first floor and a basement, but the landscaping at Gary and Jan's house made it stand out from all the other houses in the area. Landscaping had always been a passion for Gary and Jan. They had spent years working on their flower and vegetable gardens in the back, and they had filled the front yard with plants and various design accents like a concrete bench with cupids and hearts carved into it. Gary slipped off his gardening gloves, stood up, and stretched out his back. Gary was average height with graying hair and a receding hairline. Gary heard the back door open, so he turned and he saw his wife Jan walking towards him. She was carrying a glass of water, and she had a big smile on her face like she usually did. Jan was 61 years old. She had brown hair down to her shoulders, and she wore glasses. When Jan reached Gary, she handed him the glass of water and told him he should really take a break. So they sat down together on a bench, and they talked about what else they could plant to add even more color to their gardens. Then Jan took Gary's hand, and they sat there quietly, just looking out over their perfect yard. The truth was, the garden was much more than just another landscaping project to Gary and Jan. It had been like a sanctuary to them for years. Gary and Jan had met and fallen in love over 30 years earlier in the 1980s. Soon after they had gotten married, they started a family, first welcoming their daughter Jessica, and then their son Jimmy. But when Jimmy was only a toddler, Gary and Jan had gotten the worst news they could imagine. Their little boy had been diagnosed with cancer. After Jimmy's diagnosis, Gary and Jan had moved to the house in Springfield to be closer to medical facilities for their son's treatments. But unfortunately, at the age of 3, Jimmy had passed away. Gary and Jan knew they would never get over the death of their son. But the garden they started in the backyard of their home became their quiet, beautiful place where they could go and sit and remember their son. And soon it became a place where they could retreat from stress and pain and just spend time together. It really was their sanctuary. Over the years, Gary and Jan had started to heal as best as they could from the terrible loss of their son, and they both turned their grief into a desire to help others. Gary had dedicated his life to education and working with children. He had been a history teacher, a school principal, and then he had gone on to serve as the assistant superintendent in his school's district. Jan volunteered her time sewing and crocheting for cancer patients. And even though nobody other than Gary knew, Jan also paid for milk and food items at the local school cafeterias to help cover the costs for kids who couldn't afford to buy those things on their own. And even after Gary had retired from working in the school district for decades, he wanted to remain an educator. So he had taken a position at a local college as an adjunct history instructor. So as much as Gary and Jan loved to escape from the stress and grief of life by going into their garden, they both still believed it was their job to stay engaged in their community and to help others as much as they could. In the garden, Gary finished his water and cleaned up his supplies. Then he and his wife went inside their house. Jan sat down on the living room couch and called their daughter Jessica. Jessica was in her late 20s, and she lived about 300 miles away in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Jan and Gary still talked to their daughter just about every single day. Jessica would call her mom every morning, and her dad would text her every night before he went to bed. But lately, Jessica and Jan had been on the phone with each other even more than usual because Jessica was planning her wedding. And that day, Jan had called Jessica to set up a time for them to go wedding dress shopping together. They decided Jessica would drive up to Missouri in a couple of weeks, stay with her parents, and she and Jan would shop for as long as they needed until she found the perfect dress. While Jan talked to Jessica on the phone, Gary made his way through the first floor of the house towards his home office. It was true that the outside landscaping Gary and Jan had done over the years really did set their house apart, but the inside of their house was also very different from other homes. In fact, the inside of their home wasn't like anything anyone in the neighborhood had ever seen. The inside of Gary and Jan's house was like a small museum or a curiosity shop filled with all kinds of rare items. Gary loved world history. That's why he continued to teach the subject even after he had technically retired. But Gary's love of history had also turned him into an avid collector. At first, Gary had begun collecting things like old books or rare furniture pieces he found at garage sales. But over the years, Gary's collecting had turned into something way bigger than just a hobby. The walls on the first floor of the house were covered with shelves, and those shelves displayed antique handguns and rifles, Native American spearheads, first edition books, jars filled with old coins from all over the world, and countless other collectibles. On his way to his office, Gary stopped for a second in front of a large wooden table that displayed his prized possession, 3 rare 19th century scrimshaw walrus tusks. Scrimshaw was the art of hand-carving detailed pictures or intricate designs into bone or ivory objects like whale and walrus tusks. Gary looked at his prized tusks and he smiled. Each one was worth about $10,000, but their monetary value was not really why Gary loved them so much. As a collector, he had to work hard to track down these kinds of very rare items. He combed through catalogs, visited antique dealers, talked to other collectors, and still went to local garage and estate sales in search of rarities. So these 3 scrimshaw tusks represented a lot of time and effort by Gary. And the artwork and craftsmanship of these 3 pieces just totally blew Gary away. Gary stepped away from the walrus tusk display, walked down a hallway, and went into his office. The shelves in his office were overflowing with books. Some were hard to find and long out of print, and others were just books about history that Gary enjoyed reading. Gary sat down at his desk, and he reached over into a jar that was filled with all these silver coins. Like the walrus tusks, most of these coins were very rare and worth a lot of money, and Gary was on a mission to catalog all of them. Cataloging items in his collection made it much easier for him to trade with other collectors because that way he knew exactly what he had, and he could give others a description of all the objects he owned. But cataloging coins was also kind of like sitting in the garden for Gary. There was something about the sound the coins made when they clinked against each other, and the time it took to determine exactly when and where each coin was from that brought Gary a real sense of peace. Gary wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting at his desk cataloging these rare coins when his phone buzzed in his pocket and it sort of snapped him out of his peaceful trance. He grabbed his phone and glanced down at the number that was calling him, and he saw it belonged to one of his closest friends, Mark Porter. Mark had been the superintendent of the school district back when Gary was the assistant superintendent, and the 2 men had gotten along really well. It turned out that Mark shared Gary's interest in collecting coins, so the 2 men had remained close friends even after they both had retired. Gary and Mark talked for a few minutes about maybe getting together for dinner soon, and then Mark asked how Gary's work with his latest coin collection was going. The truth was, Mark loved that Gary had this huge collection to spend his time on, but Mark also worried that Gary was a little naive about the world he'd been drawn into. Most collectors and antique dealers were like Gary. They were good people who just had a real love of history. But there were some people who saw collectors like Gary as very easy targets because they were in possession of items that were worth a ton of money. And there were times when Mark worried if Gary really knew enough about the different people he was reaching out to in order to make potential buys or trades with. It wasn't really clear if Gary actually understood if these business partners of his were good people with good intentions or not. On the phone, Gary told Mark that everything was going great with cataloging his coins and he'd be able to see if anyone was interested in buying them soon. And he reassured Mark that he would only work with reputable collectible coin dealers when the time came to actually sell them. Then the 2 friends agreed to meet for dinner the following week, and they said goodbye. Not long after Gary hung up on Mark, Jan walked into the office, and she told Gary that their daughter, Jessica, would be coming up from Oklahoma soon to go shopping for a wedding dress. Gary stood up, and he had a huge grin on his face. He loved when his daughter came to visit, and he knew how happy it made Jan to spend time with their daughter. Gary put his arm around Jan, and the 2 of them walked out of the office and into the living room. They sat down on the couch, and Jan leaned her head on Gary's shoulder. Gary and Jan had been together over 30 years, and they had been through some really horrible things together, but they had come out on the other side. They were happy and healthy, and just as much in love with each other as they had been on the day they first got married. A few days later, on April 30th, 2014, Gary kissed Jan by the door that led to their garage, and then Gary headed out to his car. He was going to head out to teach one of his classes at the local college. Jan watched as Gary pulled out of the garage and headed down the driveway, and then once he was gone, Jan shut the garage door and then walked back inside into the living room. She sat down on the couch and called her daughter Jessica. They talked about Jessica's wedding planning, and Jan reminded her that if she needed help with anything, all she had to do was ask. Jessica's house in Oklahoma City was only about a 5-hour drive to Jan and Gary's, and they did see each other fairly often. But Jan secretly wished that Jessica and her fiancé lived closer. And even though Jan didn't say this, she really hoped when Jessica had children of her own, she would move back to Springfield, because Jan would want to be as close to her grandkids as possible. Jan and Jessica talked for a bit longer, and then Jan told her daughter she loved her and she couldn't wait to see her. Jan hung up her phone and then walked across the first floor to the basement door. Now, while she and Gary did call the basement, in reality, it really wasn't. It had been converted into another living space years earlier, complete with a small kitchen, so it was kind of like an apartment. Jan walked down the stairs and into the basement kitchen. She spent a lot of time down there canning vegetables. Jan didn't take canning as seriously as Gary took his collecting, but it was still a hobby she loved. But before Jan could get started canning that day, she thought she heard footsteps upstairs. She knew she'd been on the phone with Jessica for a while, but she still thought it was way too early for Gary to be home from his class. Jan walked over to the basement steps and called upstairs to see if maybe Gary was there, but nobody called back. Then Jan heard heavy footsteps running across the floor right above her, and suddenly her breath was caught in her chest and she felt scared. Then the basement door at the top of the stairs swung open, and Jan looked up and saw someone running down the stairs right at her. The next day, on May 1st, 2014, Jessica, Gary and Jan's daughter, nervously tapped her foot and stared down at her phone inside of her house in Oklahoma City. Jessica was starting to panic because she hadn't heard from either of her parents since she talked to her mom the day before, and that wasn't normal. Her dad always texted her to say goodnight no matter where he was or what he was doing, and he didn't do that the night before, and she talked to her mom every morning, and that morning she had not heard from her mom. Jessica's fiancé, Jason, tried to calm her down. He was sure there was a totally normal explanation for why Gary and Jan had stopped being in touch. Maybe they fell asleep early the night before and maybe slept in this morning. But Jessica just couldn't believe that. She knew something was wrong, and so she couldn't relax. Jessica and her mom looked a lot alike. They had the exact same smile, but Jessica had blonde highlights in her shoulder-length brown hair. On this day, Jessica wore a gray sweatshirt and jeans. As for Jessica's fiancé, Jason, he was a big guy, and he was what some people might call the strong, silent type. In their Oklahoma City living room, Jessica got up and started to pace back and forth. At noon, she still had not heard from her parents, and so she really began to feel worried. By this point, Jason could see how upset his fiancé was, and so he told her, just call the police up in Springfield and ask them to do a wellness check on your parents. This would mean a police officer would go to Jan and Gary's house and just knock on the door and make sure everything was okay. Jessica looked up the non-emergency number for the Springfield Police Department, and she gave them a call. She told them she was really worried about her parents, and she gave them her parents' address. The officer on the other line assured her they would send somebody over to the house immediately. Jessica hung up the phone and then sat back down and waited. It felt like hours had passed, but in reality, the police called Jessica back pretty quickly. An officer told Jessica that they had gone by her parents' house, and while they didn't actually talk to her parents, nothing seemed out of the ordinary about their home. The doors were all locked, there was no sign of forced entry anywhere. The house looked totally normal. Jessica thanked the officer for going over and looking around, but after she hung up, she told Jason that that was not good enough for her. She was sure there was something wrong and somebody actually needed to speak to her parents. Jessica tried calling both of her parents again, but again, neither of them answered. So Jessica told Jason that they needed to drive to Springfield to see in person what was going on here. So at about 2 p.m. that day, Jessica and Jason walked outside to their car to begin the 5-hour drive to Springfield. Jason drove as fast as he could, and he and Jessica barely spoke on the ride, and then just a little before 7 p.m., Jason pulled the car into Gary and Jan's driveway. Right away, Jessica reached into her purse, and she took out the garage door opener she had for her parents' house. She pressed the button, and she and Jason watched as the garage door opened up, and inside, Jessica saw both of her parents' cars were parked. And when Jessica saw that, she turned to Jason, and she said now she was certain something terrible had happened. Jessica slowly got out of the car, but she didn't dare go inside the house. Instead, she dialed 911 and waited outside for the police to arrive. A few minutes after Jessica called 911, a police cruiser arrived in front of the house. 2 uniformed officers stepped out of the car and approached Jessica and Jason, who were still standing outside in front of the house. The officers saw the garage door was open and that there were 2 cars parked inside. The officers asked Jessica and Jason if either of them had gone into the house. Jessica said they hadn't, but she was sure something was wrong. She also told them the door that led into the house from the garage was always unlocked. The officers told Jessica to wait outside, and then they walked into the garage. Jessica was right. The door in the garage leading into the house was unlocked. So the officers walked through that door into the house and made their way down a hallway towards the front of the house. And not far from the front door, they saw a man's body lying in a pool of blood with a gunshot wound to his chest. As soon as they saw this, one of the officers called into the station, and then both officers drew their guns and began slowly making their way through the rest of the first floor. The officers were tense. They had no idea if the shooter was still in the house. They didn't find anyone else on the first floor, so they made their way to the basement door, they opened it up, and began going down the stairs, again with their guns drawn. But before even making it halfway down the steps, the officers saw another body. It was a woman lying face down on the floor below. Even from a distance, they could see a gaping wound in the back of her head. Later that evening, Jessica and her fiancé Jason were still anxiously waiting outside. But this whole time, they had stood there and watched multiple police cruisers arrive one after another, and they had watched as police officers blocked off Jessica's parents' house with yellow police tape. One officer had told Jessica and Jason that 2 bodies had been found inside of the house, but those bodies had not been identified yet. However, Jessica knew it had to be her parents, and she'd be right. In the darkness, Jessica watched another car pull up in front of the house. This one was not a police cruiser, but a sedan. And out of the sedan came 2 tall, thin men wearing suits with buzzed brown hair. In the low light, the 2 men could easily pass as brothers. The men approached Jessica and Jason and introduced themselves as detectives Chris Barb and Neil McCamus of the Springfield Police. Like the first officers on the scene, the detectives learned that Jessica and Jason had not gone inside of the house before or after they called 911. Barb and McCamus asked them to continue waiting outside, and then the 2 detectives made their way inside of the house. Once they were inside, they joined the state forensics officers in the front room where Gary's body was lying. The detectives were immediately taken aback by the amount of blood that had pooled around his body, and they soon discovered that Gary had been shot and bludgeoned. While this type of violence was shocking to see, even for these experienced detectives, there were a couple of other things about the scene that really stood out to them. Gary's pants were pulled down to about the middle of his thighs, but Barb and McCamus didn't think it looked like someone had tried to undress Gary. Instead, they thought maybe someone might have dug through Gary's pockets after he was dead, and Gary's pants had sort of slipped off his waist. But Gary's pants being down were not remotely the strangest aspect about the scene. Forensics officers had found white dust and flakes all over Gary's body. It was clear to investigators that the dust was not cocaine or any other kind of drug, but they had no idea what it was. So, as forensics officers collected samples of the white dust for testing, detectives Barb and McAmis followed a uniformed officer across the first floor and down to the basement. At the bottom of the stairs, another forensics officer was crouched over Jan's body. Barb asked if the wounds on Jan's body matched the ones on Gary upstairs, and the officer said only partially, because Jan had not been shot like Gary had been. Barb and McAmis crouched down, and just like upstairs, they saw the same white dust and flakes. They also saw a latex glove turned inside out on the floor, not far from Jan's body. The detectives left the forensics team to do their work in the basement, and they made their way back upstairs and through the rest of the house. Eventually, they went into the garage, and they saw a concrete floor-to-ceiling tornado shelter standing in the corner. Garage shelters like that were pretty common in the area because Missouri was part of what's often called Tornado Alley, an area of the United States that experiences a ton of tornadoes. But detectives Barb and McAmis noticed something strange about this tornado shelter right away. A combination lock had been added to the structure. While locks were not out of the ordinary for outdoor shelters, they weren't that common in garage shelters. Because the idea that during a tornado, people would rush into their garage to get in their shelter and then have to fiddle around with a lock first just felt really unnecessary. And so Barb and McAmis walked over to the shelter to get a better look at this lock. And when they got there, it was clear someone had struck that lock over and over again in a failed attempt to get it to open. So the detectives were pretty sure that Gary and Jan had converted this tornado shelter into a sort of safe, hence the lock. And then whoever had killed them had then tried to break into this safe, meaning whoever had killed them knew Gary and Jan had converted the shelter into a safe. They knew where the safe was, and they very likely had an idea of what was inside of it. And so, for detectives Barb and McAmis, there was now one very obvious suspect: Gary and Jan's daughter, Jessica, who had apparently been so worried about her parents that she drove 5 hours to check on them, but apparently not worried enough to actually go inside the house. Late at night on May 1st, so a few hours after police had arrived at Gary and Jan's house, Detective Barb led Jessica and Jason into a small interrogation room at the police station. Barb motioned to a small wooden table that was pushed up against a wall that looked like it hadn't been repainted in decades. Jessica and Jason sat down at that table, and then Barb took a seat across from them. Barb was calm and measured, and he told Jessica how sorry he was about her loss. But he made it clear there were a few things that seemed really strange to him. Barb couldn't understand why Jessica and Jason had driven all the way from Oklahoma only to arrive at Jessica's parents' house, and then Jessica doesn't go inside to see if her parents need any help. But all Jessica would say in response to this was that as soon as she saw her parents' cars were in the garage, she knew something terrible had happened, and she didn't want to see it. And that was why she had just called the police and waited outside. Detective Barb nodded and jotted down a few notes on a pad of paper. Barb's face never gave anything away, but Jessica's reasoning still seemed very odd to him. And in fact, he had heard answers like Jessica's before. In murder cases, Barb had come into contact with people who left the scene after they had killed their victims and then contacted police to try to remove suspicion from themselves. But these killers would pretend they had not even seen the victims because they simply could not confront what they had done. So they would say things like they knew something was wrong, but that they had no idea what police would actually find inside, when in reality, of course they would know. And that's exactly what Jessica's response sounded like to Detective Barb. Now, he was not ready to just declare Jessica guilty, but he definitely still considered her a major suspect despite her explanation. Because in addition to her strange behavior at the house, Barb and his team had discovered some very important information since they had arrived at Jan and Gary's house that really only began to point more suspicion at Jessica. It turned out that Gary's collection of rare and historical items was worth hundreds of thousands of US dollars. And like police thought, Gary and Jan had converted that garage tornado shelter into a safe. And that safe held tens of thousands of dollars worth of gold and silver. So, Detective Barb knew that Jessica was the only child of wealthy parents, and she stood to inherit a lot of money when her parents died. In the interrogation room, Barb's voice remained totally calm, almost casual, like he was talking to a friend. He asked Jessica if she was angry at her parents for any reason. But Jessica just looked at him and shook her head no. She said her parents were her whole life. Then, Barb asked her if she had resented her parents for keeping their money from her or anything like that. And a confused and almost angry look suddenly came across Jessica's face. She told Barb that if she ever wanted money, or anything else from her parents for that matter, all she had to do was ask and they'd give it to her. Barb thanked Jessica and Jason for coming in, and then he let them go. Jessica might be a prime suspect, but Barb knew he needed a lot more evidence to be able to hold her. So Detective Barb and McCamus regrouped and started to put together a list of people who were close to Gary and Jan and who might have information about the crime or about Jessica. And the first person they wanted to talk to was Gary's friend and fellow collector, Mark Porter. At 7 p.m. on May 2nd, the day after Gary and Jan's bodies had been discovered, Mark Porter sat in an interrogation room similar to the one Jessica and Jason had been in the day before. Mark was 53 years old, and he was tall and handsome with salt and pepper hair. Detective Barb was once again handling the interview, and he asked Mark if he knew of any friends or family that might have wanted to harm Gary and Jan. But Mark shot down that idea right away. People in the community loved Gary and Jan because they both spent so much of their time helping other people. And Mark said as for their daughter, Jessica, she loved her parents and had a great relationship with them. Before Barb could press him further, Mark said there was a much more obvious path investigators should be following. Mark said he was almost positive that Gary and Jan had been killed because of something having to do with Gary's collection. And he added that someone could have stolen stuff from Gary worth thousands of dollars, and it would be almost impossible to know it was missing because Gary had amassed such a large collection of all different kinds of rare items. Then Mark shook his head and fell silent. Detective Barb asked him what was wrong, and Mark just kept shaking his head. Then he looked up at Barb and said that he had seen at least one text message exchange between Gary and a potential buyer, and something about this exchange had just seemed off to Mark. Mark told Barb that he had tried to warn Gary not to go into business with this guy in the text messages, but now Mark said he wished he had really pushed Gary to truly walk away from that deal. Detective Barb thanked Mark for his time and for the information he'd provided. And after Mark left, Barb met with the rest of the investigative team. None of the investigative team were familiar with the world of collectors that Gary and Mark and others were a part of, but they all knew that when it came to things worth a lot of money, there were going to be people involved who would do anything to other people to get their hands on those items. Now, Barb needed to figure out if something, one of the collectibles or multiple collectibles, were missing from Gary's house. Police could go through Gary's catalogs, but there was no guarantee that everything Gary had ever collected would be listed in those catalogs, so this was going to be a really difficult chore. So Barb reached out to Gary's brother to see if maybe he could help. Gary's brother was a respected attorney in the area, and he was probably more familiar with Gary's complete collection than anyone, because he had helped Gary with legal and financial issues related to collecting some of these rare objects. Detective Barb wasn't willing to rule Jessica out as a suspect, but what Mark had said did make a lot of sense, and investigators started focusing on the murders as possibly being the result of a robbery, and they hoped either Gary's brother or the test results from the mysterious white dust they were waiting on would lead them to the killer. On May 10th, so 10 days after Jan and Gary's murders, their daughter Jessica stood at the front of a massive crowd that had gathered inside of a high school gym. The outpouring of love for Jan and Gary from the community had been overwhelming, and it became clear that a funeral home would not be large enough to accommodate everybody who wanted to pay their respects to Gary and Jan. So the school district, where Gary had worked for decades, let the family use a local high school gym for a memorial service. But as Jessica listened to friends and other family members talk about how much her parents had meant to them, one thought kept coming into her mind. This was the day she was supposed to go dress shopping with her mom, and now her parents wouldn't even get to be there for her wedding, and they would never get to meet their grandkids. Jessica just started sobbing, and Jason wrapped his arms around her and pulled her face to his chest. The fact that Jessica had lost her parents was devastating, but Jason could not believe that on top of that, she also had to endure being a primary suspect in their murders. After the service was over, Jason stood by Jessica outside the gym as she greeted people she had known since she was a kid. And most of them were also appalled that she was being treated like a suspect. Finally, Jessica's uncle, so Gary's brother, approached them and gave Jessica a hug. He didn't believe Jessica would ever do anything to hurt her parents, but as an attorney, he understood why police had focused on her. After all, she was the sole heir to her parents' fortune, and she had acted a little strange at their house on the day that Gary and Jan's bodies were discovered. But he was sure Jessica would soon be crossed off the suspect list, and he was also determined to help police discover if anything really had been stolen from Gary's collection. In the following weeks, with Gary's brother's help, investigators started to believe they were getting closer to identifying Jan and Gary's killer. But they still needed more evidence to be sure they were right and to create an airtight case that would actually hold up in court. But as more time passed, the people who were closest to Gary and Jan put added pressure on the police because they felt like the investigation had started to drag. And on top of that, some of Gary and Jan's friends and neighbors had begun to get frightened because they had no idea if Gary and Jan had been the killer's only target or if they too were also in danger. 3 months after Jan and Gary's murder, Gary's friend, Mark Porter, sat in the small lobby of a quick-service oil change garage. Mark sipped on a cup of coffee from a fast food restaurant and waited for his oil change to be finished. Then, a man walked in and sat down right next to Mark, which was odd because there were plenty of other seats available in the lobby. But Mark didn't think too much about it, he just kept drinking his coffee. Then this man started to talk to Mark. It was just small talk, and Mark responded politely. Finally, Mark heard someone behind the counter call his name. Mark put down his coffee, nodded to the stranger who had been talking to him, paid for his oil change, and then went outside to his car. But as Mark drove away, he got this weird, uneasy feeling in his stomach. Who was that guy, and why had he sat down right next to him and just started talking to him? It just felt odd. When Mark got home, he started to worry that that strange guy might be somehow connected to the murders of Gary and Jan. But as Mark continued to fret over the next few days about this mystery guy and what he meant, Detectives Barb and McAmis decided they were ready to make an arrest. Because they now knew what had been stolen from Gary's collection, and they knew what that mysterious white dust was that was found at the scene. So they were sure about who had killed Gary and Jan and how they had done it. Based on evidence found at the murder scene, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and the test results from the white dust and flakes found inside of Gary and Jan's home, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the night of April 30th, 2014, when someone murdered Gary and Jan Terrell. It was still light outside, so the killer casually walked up to Jan and Gary's front door as if they were just there for a visit. They had a large gym bag with them slung over their shoulder. From the porch, the killer glanced over their shoulder to make sure none of the neighbors were outside. Satisfied, the killer reached into their pants pocket and pulled out a pair of latex gloves. The killer slipped on the gloves and then reached into their other pocket and pulled out a key. They used that key to open the door, and they stepped inside. The house was quiet. The killer started down the hallway towards Gary's office, but then they heard a voice calling from downstairs in the basement. The killer froze and started to panic. Then the voice in the basement called out again, at which point the killer made a decision on the spot. The killer rushed to a wooden table nearby and grabbed one of those 3 scrimshaw walrus tusks that were on display. Then the killer, carrying one of those tusks, ran across the first floor towards the basement. They flung open the basement door and quickly descended the stairs. In the basement, Jan, who was the one calling upstairs, she began to scream. She saw the killer rushing towards her, so she turned away from the stairs, but there was nowhere for her to go. The killer reached the bottom of the stairs and caught up to Jan. They clutched that walrus tusk in both hands like a baseball bat, and then they swung. The tusk cracked the back of Jan's head, and she fell face down onto the floor. Blood immediately spilled from the wound, but the killer thought they could still hear her breathing. So the killer stood over Jan's body, raised up the walrus tusk again, and slammed it back down into the back of Jan's head multiple times. With each blow to the back of Jan's head, white dust and flakes fell off of that tusk. It would later be determined that the killer had used so much force when smashing Jan's head with that tusk that pieces of Jan's hair were literally embedded into her skull. Finally, the killer stopped smashing Jan's head with the tusk. They stood there for a second and then went back to the basement stairs and headed back up to the first floor. Everything had happened so quickly that the killer didn't realize one of their latex gloves had slipped off their hand and fallen near Jan's body. Upstairs, the killer made their way past the front door, down the hall, and into Gary's office, still clutching the bloody tusk in one of their hands. Once in the office, they grabbed something off the desk, opened up their bag, and dropped it inside. But before the killer could take anything else, they heard the front door open. Again, the killer froze up and began to panic. Then they made another split decision. They opened up one of the desk drawers, pulled out a handgun that was inside, and then ran out of the office down the hall. When the killer got to the front door, Gary, who was the one who had opened the door, he was standing there and he was calling out for his wife. The killer shouted at Gary, and Gary turned to see them, at which point the killer raised the gun and fired. The bullet struck Gary in the chest. Blood spattered across Gary's clothes and he fell to the floor. The killer had no idea if Gary was alive or dead, but they weren't going to take any chances, so they stood over him, raised up the walrus tusk, and smashed Gary with it. Again, white flakes and dust from the tusk fell to the floor. Eventually, the killer stopped bludgeoning Gary and just stood there in the front room, breathing heavily and feeling totally crazed. Gary and Jan were now dead. The killer tried to collect themselves and calm down their breathing. Then they slipped the tusk and the gun into their bag. They got down on the floor and reached into Gary's pockets, searching for money or other valuables. Gary's pants slid down his legs as the killer did this, but the killer did not find anything of note in Gary's pockets. So the killer walked back through the house and went into the garage. There, they grabbed a hammer from Gary's tool rack and then walked over to that tornado shelter that they knew had gold and silver inside, and the killer began smashing at the lock with the hammer. But when it became clear that they could not break this lock, the killer just put the hammer back and went back inside the house. They walked past Gary's body, opened the front door, and stepped outside. It had gotten darker outside, but there was still light, so the killer tried to act as casually as they could as they locked the front door behind them, then got into their car and drove out of the neighborhood. Later that night, the killer sat down on the couch in their home, reached into the bag they had brought to Gary and Jan's house, and took out the item they had stolen from Gary's desk. It was a jar that was filled with old coins. The killer wished they could add these coins to their own collection, but instead, the killer would sell these coins as fast as they could. Mark Porter, Gary's friend and former co-worker, had been the one who murdered Gary and Jan. It would turn out Mark was in massive debt due to gambling losses and other poor financial decisions. And weeks before the murder, he had asked his friend Gary to borrow a staggering $250,000 US. Gary had been totally stunned by this request. He thought Mark was doing really well financially, and he had no idea why Mark would assume that he, Gary, had enough money to just casually give away $250,000, and so Gary had said no. Mark had said he understood and that he wouldn't press Gary anymore about the loan, but in reality, Mark had actually decided that he would go into Gary and Jan's house when Gary was off teaching a class so he could raid Gary's collection himself for some of his more high-end items and then sell them on the collector's market. Being a coin collector himself, Mark knew the worth of Gary's very rare coin collection, and he also knew the worth of a lot of the other items Gary had. So, on April 30th, Mark made his way into Gary and Jan's house to do this robbery. Investigators don't know if he stole the key he used to get inside, or if maybe Gary and Jan had given him the key since he was a friend, but either way, that was how he got in with that key. And so Mark had entered the house with the intention of just robbing Gary, but then Gary's wife, Jan, shouted from the basement, and suddenly Mark's plan fell apart. Mark grabbed the walrus tusk and rushed downstairs and beat Jan to death. But when Mark heard Gary come home, he wasn't sure if the tusk would be enough. He knew Gary kept a handgun in his desk drawer, so he grabbed it and shot Gary, and then followed it up with smashing him with the tusk as well. While investigators had initially considered Jessica their primary suspect, they were eventually able to place her at a restaurant in Oklahoma City at the time of her parents' murder. And it turned out that her reasons for not actually going into her parents' house when she drove all that way to see if they were okay were totally legitimate. When Jessica saw her parents' cars parked there, when she couldn't get in touch with them and nobody knew what was going on with them, she really did just have this gut instinct that something horrible had happened to them, and she just could not bear to see it for herself. And so that was why she had not gone in. So when Jessica was off their suspect list, investigators started digging into the possibility that someone from the collecting world had killed Gary and Jan like Mark had suggested. But then Gary's brother realized that a huge stash of rare coins was missing from Gary's office. And not long after that, police received a call from a local shop that bought, sold, and traded rare coins. And they had a video of a man who had recently sold a large coin collection for over $18,000, and the man on that video was Mark Porter. At this point, detectives Barb and McAmis thought they were close to catching their killer, but there was still a chance that Mark had simply sold some of his own coins, so they needed more proof that what he sold was actually Gary's. They asked Mark to submit a DNA sample to see if maybe they could tie it to DNA found at the scene, but Mark refused. So the police sent in an undercover cop to get the DNA sample. And so it would turn out Mark had every right to be suspicious of that stranger who had come in and sat down right next to him and chatted with him while his car was being worked on, because that stranger was an undercover police officer who ultimately left with Mark's coffee cup that he left behind inside. And the crime lab was able to connect DNA samples from the coffee cup to DNA samples that were found on the latex glove that had been left behind at the murder scene in the basement near Jan's body. Finally, detectives Barb and McAmis learned that the white dust and flakes found near the bodies had come from a walrus tusk similar to the two they had seen on display at Gary's house, so they knew what weapon Mark had used to attack and kill Jan, and then also to bludgeon Gary with after he had shot him. Mark pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received 2 consecutive life sentences. He'll be eligible for parole after he turns 82 years old. Jessica was able to speak at Mark Porter's sentencing, but she refused to put the focus on Mark. Instead, she focused on her parents, saying she would miss her parents' advice and their laughter, and she would miss telling them she loved them. On an August evening in 2010, 36-year-old Rusty Snyderman could barely contain his excitement as he talked to a small group of people in his kitchen in Dunwoody, Georgia, an upscale suburb of Atlanta. Rusty and his wife Andrea had some friends over, and people were spread out across the large suburban home, laughing, eating, and drinking. But in the kitchen, Rusty was talking to Hemi Newman, who was his wife's boss, along with a couple other friends, about a new business that Rusty was launching. Rusty was lanky with short brown hair, and he could barely see without his glasses on. And when he talked about something that he was passionate about, he used his whole body, and Rusty was very passionate about this new business idea, so he was very animated as he spoke. He told his captive audience that his idea was to start a company that provided celebrity voicemail services. So basically, somebody could pay a famous actor or singer or athlete to create the outgoing voicemail message on the person who was paying's phone, or a friend's phone as a gift or something like that. To make this more clear, if I were to pay for this, I would have a voicemail that would say, "Hey, you've reached the voicemail of John Allen, leave a message after the beep," but instead of it being my voice, it would be some celebrity saying as much. Now, remember, this was several years before celebrity video services like Cameo would come out, so the people listening to this idea had never heard of anything like this before, and they thought it was absolutely brilliant. Hemi, who was an executive at General Electric, which is a big appliance company, liked the idea, but did raise some questions about overhead costs and stuff like that. And the other people that were listening, Rusty's friends, they wanted to know how would he get these famous people on board with the concept. And Rusty, who people said was a born entrepreneur, had an answer for all their questions. And he really believed that if he did this right, the company would grow and it would even become something potentially that was so big and successful that he could pass it down to his kids. And so as Rusty was talking about his big plan, his wife Andrea stepped into the kitchen and overheard what they were talking about, and she quickly kind of chimed in that, maybe if this business is as successful as Rusty thinks, they wouldn't even need to worry about their kids' future job prospects. Their 5-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son would be just set because of this great business. And even though she was sort of joking about this, being so committed to this totally succeeding, there was some truth to that. She really believed this was going to be a success, same as Rusty. But Andrea's excitement was more about her husband having something to focus on rather than the actual company he was going to build. Andrea had known Rusty had a great mind for business since they started dating back in college at the University of Indiana. And not long after graduating, Andrea had moved with Rusty while he earned a master's degree from Harvard Business School. They had gotten married soon after that, moved to Georgia when Rusty got a job offer, and they started their family. And initially, things went great for Rusty on the work front. A few years earlier, in 2007, he'd gotten a job as the chief financial officer for a large chain of daycares, and he was making a ton of money. But over the last year, Rusty had begun clashing with the men who owned the company, and so they ultimately fired him. And that had changed everything back at their home. Andrea, who had always been kind of a math whiz, went ahead and got a job, and a really good one, a well-paying job at GE to support the family, and Rusty, who was now out of work, became a stay-at-home dad. Andrea knew Rusty did not resent her at all, even though her job often required her to travel a lot and leave him alone with the kids, but she also knew Rusty loved working. And so now that he had this new idea for this celebrity voicemail company, she just felt like he seemed so much happier and in such a better place, way better than he had been over the past couple of months. In the kitchen, Andrea grabbed a soda out of the fridge and asked her boss and Rusty's friends if they needed anything. They said they were fine, so Andrea said okay. She turned around and headed into the other room to speak to some of the other guests. Later that night, after all the guests had gone, Rusty and Andrea cleaned up the house, and as they did, they talked about what a great time they'd had. They also got excited discussing an upcoming cruise they were going on in a few months, just the two of them. Their kids would be with their grandparents, and so Rusty and Andrea would finally have time to reconnect, just the two of them. Even though things had been kind of tough the last few months, they both felt good about where their lives were heading. And to their surprise, they actually felt sort of lucky to live in this town of Dunwoody, Georgia. Rusty and Andrea had grown up in the Midwest of the United States, and they had really worried they wouldn't fit in when they moved here to the South. But over the years, Dunwoody had proven to be the perfect place for them. Their house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac in this beautiful secluded neighborhood that backed right up to sprawling woods filled with oak and pine trees. And they were close enough to Atlanta to also enjoy all the city had to offer as well. But most importantly, to Rusty and Andrea, Dunwoody had a tight, supportive Jewish community, which was not the case for a lot of suburbs in the area. Rusty and Andrea credited the Jewish community for helping them adjust to life in the South, and for weathering challenges like when Rusty had lost his job. So Dunwoody felt like home, a great town to raise their kids in, and the right place for Rusty to launch this next phase of his career. But a little later that night, as Rusty worked on his business proposal at the kitchen table, something so strange, almost completely unbelievable, was happening in Dunwoody. It was something that nobody who lived in the small suburb would have ever imagined. A few minutes from Rusty and Andrea Snyderman's house, a driver sat in their parked car on the side of a neighborhood street. The car felt ice cold, but sweat dripped down the driver's face. They could feel their chest getting tight, and they heard this loud rumbling sound coming from their passenger seat. The driver shook their head. "Please don't let this happen to me again." But there was nothing the driver could do. The car rattled, a light flashed outside, and then the demon appeared in the passenger seat. The driver tried to hide their eyes, but they couldn't look away, like the demon was forcing the driver to stare at it. The demon's head nearly touched the roof of the car, and its legs were massive. It wore a dark cloak and hood, and when the driver looked at it, they felt like all hope inside of them was just draining away. The demon turned its head away from the driver and began to talk. Its voice was deep and powerful. The driver thought the demon actually sounded like the 1970s soul and R&B singer Barry White, who was famous for songs like "Can't Get Enough of Your Love, Babe." The driver trembled, but the demon said there was no need to be afraid. The driver had been chosen to carry out a mission. The driver begged the demon to please leave them alone, but the demon said the mission was too important to ignore. Suddenly, the whole car shook and light flooded in from all sides. The driver shielded their eyes again, but they also felt a perfect sense of calm coming over them. They looked back at the passenger seat, and now the demon was gone. In its place sat an angel wrapped in light. The angel spoke, and the driver thought immediately that it sounded just like Olivia Newton-John, the actress and singer who had starred in movie musicals like Grease and Xanadu. When the angel spoke, they said the driver really was the only one who could carry out this very important mission the demon had already mentioned. So the driver asked, "What's the mission?" The angel smiled and said members of the Snyderman family were in grave danger, and the driver had to protect them. On the morning of November 10th, so about 3 months after the angel and demon appeared in that driver's car, Andrea rushed into her kitchen, holding her 5-year-old daughter's hand. Rusty was in the kitchen helping their son finish his breakfast. Andrea and her daughter both gave Rusty a kiss and told him they'd see him later, and then they headed out to the garage. Whenever Andrea was not traveling, she always made a point to drive her daughter to kindergarten on her way to work. It was just another way for her to bond with her child. After they were gone, Rusty's son finished eating, and Rusty cleaned up the kitchen and then got his son dressed for preschool. At about 8:30 a.m., Rusty carried his son out to the silver Infiniti car parked in the garage, opened up the garage door, and then buckled the boy into his car seat in the back. But before Rusty closed the car door, he hesitated. A strange smell was coming from outside. Rusty couldn't tell if it was gasoline or something else, so he walked out of the garage and scanned the yard, and he saw something move out of the corner of his eye. Rusty turned to the side of the house, and he saw someone laying in the grass. He didn't know if this person was sleeping or hurt or what was going on, so he just shouted, "Hey, are you okay?" The person jumped up and just stared at Rusty. It was a man with a thick black mustache, and he wore a wool hat and earmuffs. Rusty immediately felt like something is wrong with this person, so he turned, ran back into his garage, hopped in the car, locked the doors, and then he pulled out into the street with his little son in back. And then, as Rusty began to drive away, he looked and saw this man with the earmuffs running down a long path that led to the woods behind the cul-de-sac. Rusty had no idea what any of this meant, so he just grabbed his phone and called 911. When the emergency operator picked up, Rusty told them what he had just seen and gave as good of a description as he could of the man with the earmuffs. Rusty also said he thought he smelled something like gasoline outside of his house right before he saw this guy. The operator told Rusty they would send a police unit over right away to look around, and Rusty said, okay, great, but he still had to drive his son to school, but right after that, he would come back home and be ready to talk to police. A few minutes later, Rusty arrived at the preschool and walked his son inside, and then afterward, he headed right back home. And when he got there, police officers, firefighters, and a workman from the gas company were all arriving as well. Rusty told his story to the police again, and they said other officers were already out looking for this man he described. Then, the gas company employee said Rusty's house did have a gas leak, but nothing had been tampered with. Whoever had been at the house in the front yard didn't appear to have caused the leak. It was just an odd coincidence. And the guy said he had fixed the leak already, and the gas company employee said, the leak was a very easy fix. Later that day, after all the emergency personnel and the gas company employee were all gone, Rusty still didn't have any real answers about who the heck that guy was. Officers said that, the guy with the earmuffs could have been a homeless person sleeping near his house, but that made no sense to Rusty. Things like that just didn't happen in this neighborhood. But police had said that until they found this guy with the earmuffs and the mustache, there really wasn't much they could do. So that night, when Andrea came home and Rusty filled her in about this guy, they talked about it and just said, all we can do is be super vigilant whenever they left the house. And they said they would do their best not to worry too much. They didn't want the kids to get a sense that their parents were scared of something. But Rusty admitted he was glad that he and Andrea were leaving town for their cruise soon, and that the kids would not be at the house either. They'd be with their grandparents. And Rusty hoped that, by the time they all came back home after the cruise, things would be back to normal in the neighborhood. Meaning, the guy with the earmuffs and the mustache has been found, and hopefully will not be back anytime soon. 8 days later, at 9 a.m. on November 18th, Rusty pulled up to his son's preschool. Rusty and Andrea had gotten back from their cruise a couple of days earlier, and Rusty felt rejuvenated. And nothing strange had happened at the house since they'd returned, so he hoped that the man lying in the grass was just some weird one-time occurrence. Rusty unbuckled his son from the car seat and led him into the preschool. And then Rusty chatted with a few other parents who were also doing drop-offs, and then a few minutes later, Rusty was headed back towards his car. However, when Rusty reached his car and opened up the driver's side door, he suddenly heard footsteps, and he glanced over his shoulder, and he saw a man with brown hair and a beard walking quickly towards him. Seconds later, screams rang out in the preschool parking lot as a silver minivan peeled out and sped away. One of the other parents ran over to Rusty's car where the scream had come from. The driver's side door was still open, and Rusty lay on the ground in a pool of blood. The woman could see Rusty was still breathing, so she screamed for help and then called 911. In the shopping center right next to the preschool, a woman happened to see what was going on, and so she immediately ran into a doctor's office that happened to be nearby. And right away, a doctor and a nurse darted out of that office, and they ran over to Rusty. The doctor quickly checked Rusty's pulse and then began administering CPR. And soon, the doctor heard an ambulance siren wailing down the street. By this time, people from inside the preschool who heard all this commotion had began running outside into the parking lot. But luckily, all of the children were outside behind the school and had no idea what was happening, including Rusty's son. The ambulance arrived and paramedics took over for the doctor, trying to keep Rusty alive. They got Rusty onto a gurney, into the ambulance, and then they sped towards the hospital. A few minutes later, Detective Andrew Thompson of the Dunwoody Police Department arrived at the preschool. He saw a few of his fellow officers trying their best to keep a growing crowd away from Rusty's car. Detective Thompson had been a cop in Atlanta for 8 years before moving here to Dunwoody, but he'd only been a detective for about 2 years. And he'd also never been the lead investigator on a potential homicide, and he knew that's what he had on his hands right now. Thompson got out of his car, he briefly spoke with the officers on site, and then began taking witness statements. The few people who had seen what happened all said the same thing. A man with brown hair and a beard stepped out of a silver minivan, walked right up to Rusty Snyderman, and shot him multiple times. Then the man with the beard got back in the minivan and drove off. Other than the man having a beard, the witnesses didn't notice anything that stood out about the shooter's appearance. But one witness said the shooter seemed remarkably calm considering what he did. He walked up calm as can be, shot Rusty, and then turned and calmly walked back to the van before leaving. Detective Thompson thanked all the witnesses for their help and then kind of gently told them to please step back, and then he and the other officers began searching the area right around Rusty's car. A trail of blood now stretched out almost 40 feet across the parking lot. And to the side of the blood trail near the car, the police found 4 brass bullet casings that they believed were fired from a semi-automatic .40 caliber or .44 caliber weapon. And then, not long after Thompson and the others had found these bullet casings, Thompson got word that Rusty had unfortunately passed away at the hospital. Thompson was now officially leading a homicide investigation for the first time. While Detective Thompson searched the preschool parking lot for more evidence, Rusty's wife, Andrea, sat at her desk in GE's Atlanta offices. A minute later, her phone rang, and she noticed the call was coming in from her son's preschool. And so Andrea immediately answered, and the preschool administrator on the other line sounded very upset. She said Andrea's son was just fine, but Andrea needed to come to the school immediately. So, without thinking, Andrea grabbed her things and ran outside to her car, and as she was running towards it, she pulled out her phone and called her boss Hemi to let him know she was dealing with some kind of an emergency, and then she got in her car and sped back towards the suburbs. As soon as Andrea pulled into the preschool parking lot, she saw all these police officers who turned and looked at her, and immediately they walked right up to her, and so she rolled her window down, and they said, "You have to go to the hospital right now." Andrea demanded to know what was going on. Was her son really okay? And the police assured her her son was absolutely safe, but she still needed to go to the hospital right now. And when Andrea arrived at the hospital a few minutes later, there she would learn her husband had been gunned down in the preschool parking lot and had died shortly after. Detective Thompson spent most of the day in the preschool parking lot, working with the forensics team to see if there was any useful evidence they could find beyond just the bullet casings. But they didn't find much of anything else. So Thompson knew his biggest clues right then were that the killer had a beard and drove a silver minivan. None of the witnesses had gotten the license plate of this silver minivan, but Thompson had already called in an alert, so all the police departments in the area would be on the lookout for any vehicle that could possibly be a match. Thompson also arranged for a forensic sketch artist to meet with the witnesses and make a composite drawing of the shooter from all of their descriptions. By the time the sun set, Thompson already felt tired and a little overwhelmed, but he had no intention of stopping. So he got in his car and drove to Andrea and Rusty's house. Once he got there and parked his car, he stepped outside into the cool fall air. It was just above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And just a second later, he heard somebody calling his name. Thompson looked over and saw his boss, Sergeant Gary Cordellino, standing by his own car at the curb. Cordellino still wanted Thompson to take the lead on this case, but he knew the detective did not have a lot of experience working homicide cases, so he said he would just be there to help. Thompson thanked Cordellino for coming, and the two men walked up to the house together. Cordellino's strong New York accent was a major contrast to the soft southern drawl a lot of people in town spoke with. But just like Rusty and Andrea, Cordellino had come to consider this small town in Georgia home, even if he was originally an outsider from up north. Andrea opened up the front door, and it was clear she'd been crying. The detectives introduced themselves and asked if they could please come inside. But Andrea got a stern look on her face. She said her parents and her in-laws were there, and this was a house of mourning. She thought it was very disrespectful that the police would want to intrude so soon after her husband had died. But Detective Thompson was just not going to have this. He said they were investigating a murder, and they needed to ask her and the family some questions right now. But Andrea just repeated herself. The family was in mourning, and they had no intention of speaking to police right now. At this point, Thompson got an angry look on his face, and he was about to push Andrea further, but Sergeant Cordellino jumped in. He said they were very sorry for her and her family's loss, and then apologized to Andrea for disturbing her and her family at such a difficult time, and said they would come back the following day. Andrea's face softened, and then she thanked him and said she would be willing to talk to them tomorrow. She closed the door, and then the two detectives walked back towards their respective cars. Thompson couldn't believe what had just happened. Clearly, they needed to interview the victim's wife, like right now. But Cordellino told him that in his experience, grief could do some really strange things to people, and they were way better off not pushing Andrea right at this moment. Still, Cordellino did admit that it was worth noting that Andrea did not seem remotely eager to help.
Midnight sky so clear, shadows whispering near, magic in the air. Dancing lights so bright.
The following day, November 19th, 2010, Detective Thompson and Sergeant Cordellino returned to Andrea and Rusty's house, this time with a warrant to search the premises. Andrea still did not seem thrilled to have the police in her home, and she thought the warrant was totally unnecessary, but she still led them into the kitchen, and she and her family sat down and spoke to them. Over the course of about 2 hours, the detectives met with Andrea, her parents, Rusty's parents, and his brother, and they all pretty much said the same thing. Rusty was a great guy, people who knew him loved him, and they just couldn't imagine who would want to hurt him. This didn't surprise Thompson and Cordellino. Families often painted their dead relatives in the best possible light. It's just what you do, it's your family. Andrea told the detectives she couldn't think of anybody who fit the description of the bearded man that witnesses had seen. Then after she said it, she immediately shook her head like she had just remembered something. She said in all of the chaos and grief, she'd almost forgotten something really huge. The detectives asked what she meant, and Andrea said about a week earlier, Rusty had seen this weird guy with earmuffs on and a mustache laying in their front yard for no reason right as he was taking their son to school. Rusty had been so freaked out by seeing this guy who kind of inexplicably ran away that he called the police and gave a description of the guy. And again, part of that description was saying that this guy had this big black mustache. Thompson and Cordellino looked at each other. It was definitely possible the man with the big mustache and the earmuffs had grown out a full beard, and then by the time he was shooting Rusty, that's what you saw, his full beard, and not just a mustache. So maybe the shooter really was the same person Rusty had seen in the front yard. They talked to Andrea a bit longer, and then at some point they told her they wanted to take her and Rusty's computers to be searched. And again, Andrea got very upset. Detective Thompson thought it was strange that she still seemed unwilling to do whatever it took to help police find her husband's killer. But the detectives, in truth, did not really need Andrea to give them permission because they had a warrant. So they took the computers, then they thanked Rusty's family for talking to them, and then they left. Back at the station, Thompson and Cordellino handed off the computers for forensic data analysis, and then they dug up the report Rusty had filed about this weird guy he'd seen in his front yard. At that point, the detectives only knew there was a guy with this big mustache who might also be the big bearded guy who shot Rusty. It was not much to go on, and nobody in Rusty's family or anybody from the preschool remotely recognized this bearded guy. Then, something came to Thompson. He remembered what one of the witnesses had said, that the shooter seemed to be utterly calm when he walked up and shot and killed Rusty. And so Thompson floated the idea that, what if the shooter was a professional hitman who somebody had hired to kill Rusty? That would make sense because nobody would know who he was, and maybe he was wearing a disguise or something, and he certainly would be very calm walking up to do the killing because this is what he did professionally. And surprisingly, Cordellino did not think this was a far-fetched idea at all. In fact, he said, if this guy Rusty saw in the yard was also the shooter, this hitman potentially, he could have been at the house that day tracking Rusty's movements and learning his routines, something a professional killer would likely do. And when the detectives began delving into emails and other information they had found on Rusty and Andrea's computers, the hired killer theory only began to make more sense. The detectives found that during his time working as a chief financial officer, Rusty had clashed repeatedly with the business owners. And based on the emails, he and Andrea were not shy about telling other people exactly how they felt about those men. Also, since Rusty had begun working on creating his own company, the Celebrity Voicemail Company, he'd worked closely with a business partner as well as several potential investors. So there was a chance that maybe Rusty had just angered the wrong people when talking trash about his former bosses, or maybe he'd had a financial dispute with someone who was working with him on his new business. The detectives kept digging into Rusty and Andrea's computer data, but they also knew they could break everything wide open if they could just locate the silver minivan the shooter had been driving. So, with the help of other police departments in the state, they expanded the search radius for this minivan beyond just the Atlanta metropolitan area. And so soon, police were scouring security camera footage from roads and stores surrounding the city. The detectives also put together a list of people who might have had the motive and the money to hire a hitman to take Rusty out. On November 21st, 2010, so 3 days after Rusty's murder, sheets hung over the mirrors in Rusty and Andrea's house, and friends and family sat together on low stools in the front room. Rusty's funeral had taken place earlier that day, and now the people who had been closest to him were sitting Shiva. Shiva is a Jewish tradition in which family and friends gather together to mourn a dead loved one. They'll say prayers and often receive condolence calls from others. At the house, Andrea thanked her boss, Hemi, and her GE coworkers for coming. They had all been so worried about her when she got that call saying something was wrong at her son's preschool, but none of them could have imagined that that call would eventually lead to this. A little while later, Andrea's boss, Hemi, began to lead the whole group in a prayer. Over 100 members of Hemi's extended family had actually died in the Holocaust, and so that had always inspired him to remain an active member of the Jewish community and to provide any help he could to those close to him, like Andrea. But while Andrea was sitting Shiva and listening to Hemi give this prayer, Detective Thompson and Cordellino just could not shake the feeling that Andrea had to be somehow involved in her husband's death. The police were still desperately trying to find the shooter's silver minivan, but their potential hired hitman theory had also led them to delve into Rusty's finances, and they had discovered that Andrea stood to get a $2 million payout from Rusty's life insurance policy. So along with being the murder victim's spouse, which by default made them a huge potential suspect, Andrea also had a clear financial motive to want her husband dead. And on top of that, she really had not seemed like she wanted to cooperate with police. And so the detectives decided they had to speak to Andrea again, but this time they wanted to isolate her from the rest of her family. On November 24th, almost a week after the murder, Thompson and Cordellino sat down with Andrea in an interview room at the police station. Andrea tucked her brown hair behind her ear, adjusted her glasses, and stared across a small white table at the two detectives. Thompson and Cordellino could tell Andrea was all business, and that she still clearly resented having to speak with the police. But they still started by thanking her for coming in, and then they asked her how her relationship had been with her husband prior to his murder. Andrea admitted things had gotten a bit strained between them when Rusty lost his job, but she said they'd worked through that. And other than typical husband and wife arguments, they actually got along really well. Andrea seemed totally matter-of-fact when she answered these questions. On the one hand, the detectives thought that made her seem almost unfeeling about her husband's death, like she didn't care. But Cordellino realized that this was a woman dealing with an impossible situation. Also, she was used to being in high-powered business meetings, so maybe this was just the way she conducted herself. Then, at some point, Cordellino asked Andrea if it was possible that Rusty could have been having an affair. Was there a jealous lover out there who might have had it out for him? But Andrea didn't flinch. She sort of half smiled and said the idea that Rusty was cheating on her was absurd. He was one of the most loving, supportive people she had ever met. He would never, ever do something like that to their family. So the detectives moved from Andrea and Rusty's personal relationship to their financial situation. But nothing Andrea said indicated that she would have killed Rusty for his life insurance policy. Rusty had put a lot of money away during his time working, and she got paid well at GE, so really, money was not an issue for them. So eventually, the detectives wrapped up the interview and thanked Andrea for her time. But after she left, Thompson and Cordellino felt like they didn't know much more than they did before she showed up. And for the life of them, they could not decide if that was because Andrea really just didn't know anyone who would want to hurt her husband, or if she was hiding something. In the weeks following that interview, no new leads came in, and Thompson and Cordellino began to get frustrated. They still didn't know if the man with the earmuffs and the mustache that Rusty had seen at the house was also the bearded shooter, or if those were two totally different people. And the detectives didn't know if this full bearded shooter had been hired by somebody else, or if it was someone who knew Rusty, that they had somehow overlooked, that maybe had a specific reason to attack Rusty. But then, in mid-December, so about a month after Rusty's murder, Detective Thompson was sitting at his desk when one of his team members rushed over to him. And this young cop had a huge smile on his face. Thompson asked him what was going on, and the young cop said he'd been re-watching surveillance footage of the silver minivan as it drove down a street near the preschool. There still was not a clear shot of the license plate, but the young cop had spotted a small white sticker on the van's windshield that nobody had caught before. And he was sure that that was the type of sticker that rental car companies used to track their vehicles. Immediately, Detective Thompson stood up, full of energy. The young cop said, the sticker didn't point to a specific rental car company, but Thompson just put his hand up and said, nope, that doesn't matter. This is a huge discovery. Armed with this new information about this sticker, police reached out to and visited rental car companies all across the area. And after about a week or so of searching, they finally found a silver Kia Sedona minivan at a rental car lot 25 miles north of Dunwoody. And that van could absolutely match the shooter's vehicle. And when they checked that minivan's recent rental history, Thompson and Cordellino immediately recognized the name that came up. And they were sure right then and there they had found Rusty's killer. Based on information from the rental car company, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, this is what police think happened to Rusty Snyderman on the morning of November 18, 2010. On that day at about 5:45 a.m., the killer heard the voice of the angel ringing in his head. That voice, that sounded just like Olivia Newton-John, had told the killer that time was running out. People were in danger, and the killer had their marching orders. This mission had to be accomplished now. The killer climbed into a silver minivan and then pulled out into the dark, empty early morning streets. The killer drove slowly, moving from dark to light as the van passed under each street lamp. Finally, they pulled the van onto Rusty and Andrea's street about an hour before the sun would rise. They parked their car a few houses down from Rusty's, and then they waited. But soon, the killer noticed lights turning on in some of the houses as people got ready for work and school and their morning routine. So the killer drove the van out of the neighborhood and found a spot on the street not too far from Rusty's son's preschool. The killer sat in the van, occasionally hearing the sound of the angel's voice encouraging them. And then at some point, the killer leaned over, opened up the glove box, and pulled out a semi-automatic pistol. They checked to make sure the gun was loaded, and when they saw it was, the killer laid down on the passenger seat. As the sun rose, the killer continued to just lay there, breathing very slowly in and out, very rhythmically, to ensure they remained calm. Then finally, around 9 a.m., the killer sat up and saw Rusty's Infiniti driving down the street towards them. The killer let Rusty drive by, and then quickly pulled out of their parking space, and then slowly tailed Rusty all the way to the preschool parking lot, and once they got there, the killer parked a few spaces away from Rusty's car. The killer watched as Rusty led his son into the preschool and began chatting with some parents inside of the doorway. As Rusty did this, the killer grabbed the gun off the passenger seat and held it in their lap. Then, a few minutes later, the killer saw Rusty walking back towards his car. At this point, the killer opened up the minivan door and, calm as can be, walked across the parking lot. Rusty had managed to open up his car door, but by that point, the killer was practically on top of him. The killer got within 3 feet of Rusty, raised their gun, and fired. The bullet struck Rusty on the left side of the jaw, traveling through his right shoulder and then lodged in his back. Rusty immediately collapsed to the ground, blood pouring out of his face and seeping through his shirt. The killer turned to walk back to the minivan, but then quickly wheeled back around and fired 3 more shots into Rusty's abdomen as he lay dying on the asphalt. After that, the killer turned and walked back to the minivan, got in, threw it in reverse, peeled out of the parking space, and then sped out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, the killer could see people running over to Rusty on the ground, but the killer felt confident they had killed Rusty and that the angel and demon would now be satisfied. A few minutes later, the killer pulled the van out onto a highway and disappeared into traffic. They drove for a while, exited off the highway, and then headed into a town 25 miles away from Dunwoody. There, they drove the van to the rental car company where they had gotten it, and they pulled it into the return lot. They checked the rearview mirror and looked out the windows. Nobody was nearby, so the killer reached up and yanked the brown wig off their head and also peeled the big fake beard off their face. The killer then stuffed the disguise pieces into a bag, got out of their rental car, and walked to a nearby auto repair shop where they had dropped off their real car for a minor repair the day before. The killer quickly paid for the work on their car and then drove off, headed towards General Electric's Atlanta offices. Some members of the investigative team had remained convinced that Rusty's wife Andrea had killed Rusty, but it turned out the shooter was somebody else who worked at GE. Andrea's boss, Hemi Newman. Police had talked to Hemi when they interviewed Andrea's friends and coworkers, but they didn't really focus on him as a potential suspect until they discovered the minivan at the rental car company. Hemi had used his real name to rent that car, and seeing Hemi's name on the rental form led Thompson and Cordellino back to Andrea's computer. And it turned out that she and Hemi had exchanged a number of emails that led police to believe their relationship was far more than just boss and employee. After police traced the rental van to Hemi, they interviewed and then arrested him. But they continued to push Andrea because they believed she and Hemi had worked together to kill Rusty, 2 lovers who wanted to be rid of Andrea's husband. That's when things got really weird. Hemi admitted to being in love with Andrea, and he even suggested that they had had an affair, though Andrea denied it. Still, Hemi said he did not arrange Rusty's murder with Andrea. Instead, he was simply following orders passed down to him from a demon and an angel who happened to sound like popular singers from the 1970s and 1980s. Talking to a psychiatrist, Hemi admitted that the Barry White-sounding demon had been visiting him for decades, dating back to when he was in college. But it was not until that angel appeared to him in the car on the night he had gone to Rusty and Andrea's house, and Rusty had talked about this new idea that he was going to make this company around celebrity voicemails, that Hemi understood his role in the cosmic battle of good versus evil. According to Hemi, the angel told him that Rusty was a threat to Andrea and the kids. In fact, the angel said Hemi was the true father of Andrea's son and daughter. And apparently, Rusty had found this out, this is again according to the angel, and so Rusty was bound to eventually murder his wife and kids as a result. That is, unless Hemi stopped Rusty by killing him first. To carry out this mission, Hemi first bought a big fake black mustache and slapped it on his face along with some earmuffs, and he spied on Rusty at his house. But of course, Rusty caught him laying on the front yard, but Rusty had no idea it was actually Hemi because the disguise worked. And then after that, when Hemi learned Rusty's routine, he bought a different disguise, the wig and the big fake beard, for the day of the murder. In court, Hemi's defense team entered an insanity plea and then proceeded to trace Hemi's complete and disturbed history with this demon and angel. But the prosecution never bought any of this. They remained convinced that Hemi had concocted this whole story to avoid life in prison. They also believed that Andrea Snyderman, not some angel or demon, was the one who actually put Hemi up to murdering her husband. The jury found Hemi guilty of murder, but they also deemed him mentally ill. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and as of 2024, he is incarcerated at the Augusta State Medical Prison. But after Hemi's conviction, police and the DA stayed focused on Andrea. She was eventually arrested and charged with murder, along with multiple other counts. But the murder charge was dropped, and she was never tried in connection to her husband's death. However, Andrea was found guilty on multiple counts that pertained to hindering the murder investigation. Andrea would go on to serve just 22 months of a 5-year prison sentence, and when she got out of prison, she received the $2 million from Rusty's life insurance policy and maintained custody of her 2 kids.
Chills in the moonlight. Time to take flight. Mystic nights. Hold tight. Feel the magic ignite. Under stars so bright. Mystic nights delight. Whispers in the night. Wings that catch the light. Spirits taking flight. Through the woods we glide. No place left to hide. Feel the dark inside. Mystic nights.
Ndikubwera munzere ndinachewa ndine mimi ndinanyenyezi sindingatha kukhala powa ndikufuna kuonetsa dziko kusinda kuli pano palibe chomwe chingandiletsa malingaliro mwanga ndakhala ndikuphunzira nthawi yochepa ndikuona zinthu zosiyana moyo wanga ndikufuna kusintha ndikufuna kukhala wamkulu ndikufuna kukhala mtumiki wa anthu onse sintani sintani tikuyamba tsopano pambo zili m'manja mwathu palibe cholepheretsa tikukwera pamwamba.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time.